Shalom kulam. Welcome everyone. This particular lesson is on Torah scroll, mezuzah, and tefilin, which is also known by the abbreviation STAM. And in response to a listener's question on the kashrut of tefillin, we're going to do a deep dive into the topic based on Mishneh Torah, laws of tefillin and mezuzah and Sefer Torah, and that's the link right there. We'll look at two aspects. First, what are the requirements for each of these items? And then, do modern day versions satisfy those requirements? And as I mentioned above, the term encompassing all three of these is stam. First, we'll talk about the requirements in the text. Tefillin, which are also known in English as phylacteries, contain four parshiot. The first is Kodeshli, the second is Vaya Ki Yeviacha, the third is Shema, and the fourth is Vaya Im Shemua. These four are encased in leather, and after that they're called tefillin, and they're placed upon the head and the arm. If even one letter is incorrect, the tefillin are invalid. There's two text issues which disqualify tefillin. First, they must be written in ink, and then also they must be written on what's called kelef, or sometimes in modern pronunciations klaf, which is actually a bit incorrect because we'll explain why in a minute. Ink, when we say ink, it's referring to something that's composed of carbon black, which means candle soot or similar things, pine sap or a similar substance, a bit of honey, mixed thoroughly, pressed into wafers and dried. This is the basis of the ink that's used. When it's to be used, the ink is mixed with water, which itself was infused with oak gall or similar things, in other words, tannin, and then it can be used for writing. Is this the only kind of ink you can use? No. This is the kind of ink which is preferable for al-stam because it can be erased. In other words, the ink can be lifted off the surface and removed. But if one used oak gall water, like we used for the ink, but mixed with iron sulfate, called kalkantos in the Mishnah, which, when they mix together, give a black color. And this ink cannot be erased. Nevertheless, it's still kosher. However, use of other inks, inks of other colors, or gold leaf, invalidates the writing. So it has to be written in a black ink, and preferably the kind of ink we described up above, mixed with soot and sap and some other things. In the mezuzah, there are only two parshiot, the Shema and the Vehayim Shemua. And if even one letter is incorrect, the mezuzah is invalid, same as with the tefillin. With respect to a Torah scroll, as with the others, if even one letter is incorrect, it renders the scroll invalid. That's as far as the text itself goes. What about the parchment on which the text is written? So none of these can be written on paper or leaves or fabric. They have to be written on parchment. So in Halacha 1.6, it talks about the kinds of parchment. There are three kinds of animal skin parchment, and they're called goil, kelef, and duchsustos. Obviously, duchsustos is a Greek word. But anyway, the process to create the parchment is a bit complicated. First, remove the hair from the skin, usually using something called quicklime, which is limestone that's been brought to a high temperature and rendered into a different substance called quicklime, which is calcium oxide. Then the skin is salted. In other words, it's soaked in salt water. And then it's covered in flour. In other words, an oat flour slush. Then it's treated with oak gall, like we saw before with the ink, the oak gall contains tannin, or similar substances. Once this is done, the skin is called gewil, which is the tanned skin. Prior to this tanning process, it's only called mosan, and that's exactly the same as the unleavened bread that we eat at Pesach, and it's called that way because just as the unleavened bread is just flour and water and no kind of processing at all, so too is the rawhide that's prior to the tanning process. It's rawhide that's also not undergone any kind of tanning process. In halacha 7, if the skin was first split into two pieces, a thin part next to the hair and a thick part next to the flesh, and the parts were then processed by tanning as above, in that case, the thin part is what we mentioned above, duchsustos, and the thick part is kelef, or klaf, as it's called today. Halacha 8. And I was going to say, why is kelef the correct pronunciation and not klaf? The reason is because ata mekalef, you peel the pieces apart. It's the kelef, it's the part which is peeled off. Klaf is like a board. Anyway, halacha 8. The received tradition from Sinai is that the Sefer Torah is written on gewil on the hair side. In other words, a whole tanned hide, but written on the side where the hair had been, hair or fur or whatever. And tefilin is written on kelef, on the flesh side. Remember, the kelef is the split off portion of the tanned hide, and it's the skins, it's the flesh side of the animal. So this is not in other words, you're writing on the part that had not been split off, but rather the natural surface. And mezuzah on the duchsustos on the hair side. So that's on the duchsustos, again, is the thinner part that was peeled off, and that's the side that's next to the skin. And just like with the tefillin, you're writing on the portion that has not been sliced. If one wrote on kelef on the hair side, or gewil or duchsustos on the flesh side, in that case, the item that was produced is invalid. Despite the tradition for Torah scrolls that they be written on gewil, one may also write them on kelef. Likewise, a mezuzah may be written on kelef or gewil, but the preferable substance to write them on is duchsustos. Halacha 10 says, the skin must be from a kosher land animal species. In other words, it can't be from a fish, it can't be from a bird, though not necessarily an animal that was slaughtered in the kosher manner. It doesn't have to be kosher slaughter. It can be an animal that died on its own, or an animal that was slaughtered but not in a kosher manner. But it must be a goat or a cow or some other kosher animal. 11. The parchment used for Torah scrolls or tefillin must have been processed by a Jew, and for the purpose of writing them, for the purpose of writing the stam, in other words. That is to say, a Gentile may not process the skins. The skin that's used for mezuzah need not be processed by a Jew or for the purpose. So for some reason, the mezuzah is an exception here. Halacha 12. Another received tradition from Sinai is that both Torah scrolls and mezuzoth must be written on scribed lines on the parchment, while tefillin need not be. And part of the reason of that is that both a mezuzah, even though it's in an enclosure, it can be seen, and a Torah scroll is read in public. So both of those are things which can be seen, so they want the text to be very, very nicely written, whereas the tefillin are sewn up in the leather boxes and generally are not seen. 13. Stam which were written by a heretic Jew, must be destroyed by burning. If they were written by a Gentile or a Jew who purposely disobeys only some mitzvot, or a slave, or a woman, or a minor, in any of these cases, then they are invalid, but they should be set aside in a gniza. In other words, they have a level of holiness even though they weren't properly written, and they should be handled with care. Whereas if they were written by a heretic, they'd have no holiness whatsoever. 14. Stam which were written on non-kosher species skins, or on skins which were not processed as we wrote above by the tanning, or on skins which were not processed for the purpose of writing stam. In any of these cases, the stam is invalid. 15. The person writing must have proper intent while writing. And if, when writing any of God's holy names, he did not have proper intent, in that case, the stam is invalid. And last one here, I think, is stam may only be written in Assyrian script, which is the usual Hebrew square letters. There are a couple different traditions that the different Eidot have as to exactly how the letters are formed, but I believe they are all considered acceptable. There's other requirements. So there are 8 requirements of tefillin concerning the physical build of the of each tefillah. They must be square. The head one must have 4 compartments separated for the parshiot, while the arm ones are only 1 compartment. The order of the placement of the parshiot within the tefillah is a specific, and so forth. There's more requirements that we won't go into. And there's 20 requirements of a Sefer Torah having to do with the spacing of the letters, how the individual parchment sheets which make up the Torah scroll are attached to each other, and many other issues, which, if not fulfilled, invalidate the scroll. Among other things, the relative size of the letters is important. In other words, where there's a large letter or a small letter relative to the other letters, as is the use of oddly shaped letters, for example, the upside down nun and other instances. And also letter tags, which are those little tiny lines above attached to some of the letters. However, if the scribe wasn't careful with those, the size of the letters, the oddly shaped letters, letter tags, it nevertheless does not render the scroll invalid. On the other hand, as stated above, if even one letter is missing, or added, or changed, in that case, the scroll is invalid. And likewise, if he changed the spacing, in other words, an open parsha made closed, or he changed the layout of the shirah, or he wrote the kri instead of the ktav, in other words, in the Torah scroll, there are some words which are written a certain way, but they're pronounced a different way. And if the way they're written is called the ktav, and the way they're pronounced is called the kri, and if he wrote down the way they're pronounced instead of the way it's written, he invalidated the scroll. Okay, so let's talk about stam commonly available today. So if you look at a properly prepared Torah scroll from the Temanim, for example, they're not the only ones, but they're the ones who are most strict about it, you'll see that it looks like leather. And that is because it is. But if you look at a typical scroll outside the Temani tradition, you'll see it has a pale color. And that is because it has not been tanned, as per Rambam and the Talmud specify. Instead, the current process, which is based on Tosafot's opinion that it's a superior process, is like this. First, they dry the skin with salt on the flesh side. Then they soak it in water to soften it. Then they soak it in lime to remove the hair. Then they soak it again in water and scrape it to remove different membranes. Then they soak it in concentrated lime for several days. Then they rinse it thoroughly with water and dry it thoroughly. And then they scrape the flesh side until kalaf is achieved. So if you note, nowhere in this process is the skin tanned. In addition, the skins are initially processed with salt, usually at the point of slaughter, and usually by Gentiles. And therefore, they're already invalid for stam. So ignoring everything else, the actual parchment that's in common use is itself invalid for stam by Rambam, but also by the Talmud itself. In addition, because of scribal errors, the commonly used duchsustos is from the flesh side. In other words, it's the fat part of the peeling process, and the klaf is from the skin side, precisely the opposite of what Rambam tells us. Furthermore, they now use something called klaf mashuach, which is their klaf, which has had a liquid spread over it to make it smoother. In other words, there's a kind of a gluey materials that they let dry that's between the parchment itself and the ink that's put on it. So there's a chotzetz, devar chotzetz, between the ink and the parchment. So even if the parchment had been kosher, which it isn't, it would be invalidated, the stam would be invalidated by this process. There's other issues as well. For example, in the Torah scrolls, in the most commonly used ones, the Ashkenazi ones, and I believe the Sephardi ones as well, Ptsua Daka is spelled Dalet Kaf Hey, when, according to the ancient scrolls, it's Dalet Kaf Aleph. So that, again, is a change of spelling which invalidates the scroll. The Temanim are extremely careful when it comes to validating that their scrolls are exactly the same. So anyway, the conclusion is that sadly, it's clear that with few exceptions, modern stam is mostly invalid. And I say that with a heavy heart, because it's something which could easily be rectified. As a result, I do not accept aliyot because the scrolls are not kosher, and saying a blessing on them would be bracha levatala, a blessing in vain, and forbidden by Torah law. I recommend acquiring stam only from sources which properly process the skins and follow halacha. For example, at the website Nosach Teman, and I give this the URL there. But even there, you have to be careful what you choose, because, for example, with tefilin, they have less expensive tefillin and they have more expensive tefillin. The more expensive ones are treated with the entire tanning process, as Rambam explains. The less expensive ones, it doesn't say that they are treated that way, so I have to assume that they're not. In any case, we will catch up with you next week, and hope everybody has an easy and productive Tisha B'Av fast.